let's move it on then to talking about the overall situation at Chelsea with their owner, Roman Abramovich. You've both contributed to articles on The Athletic over the weekend since the statement was made on Saturday evening. And the essence of both articles, Adam, is what does the statement mean? What on earth is going on? What has changed?
Yeah, so I think two big statements over the weekend. The first one drops late Saturday afternoon or early evening. And yeah, I mean, there's not a huge amount in it. I think there's something like 110 words. It talks about the giving stewardship and care of Chelsea FC to the 6 trustees of the Chelsea Charitable Foundation. So, I mean, the first thing which everyone was trying to unpack is, what does stewardship and care actually mean? And the reality from a legal sense is not very much at all. It's not ownership. There's been no transfer of control or shares. There's no suggestion that Abramovich is, ceasing to be the person who is able to make decisions or run the club or fund the club or take money out of the club. So you're then left in a position where it's, okay, so what is this thing, stewardship and care? What does it actually mean? And that's what the trustees were trying to work out as well, because they were only told on Saturday afternoon, a few hours before the statement dropped, that this statement was going to come. And they were told by Bruce Buck, who's both the chairman of Chelsea and of the trustees. The trustees, if people aren't aware, they are Emma Hayes, who is the women's team manager. You have John Devine, who is a sports lawyer who doesn't work for the club. Paul Ramos, who is the director of finance. And you then have people such as Piara Power, who is used to run Kick It Out, now runs the FAIR network, which is an anti-discrimination network across Europe. You have Hugh Robertson from the British Olympics.
Seb Coe, kind of informally.
Yeah, and then you have Seb Coe, who, Seb Coe is not listed as a trustee, but has been part of the initial consultation process and talks. And I think the concern for the trustees at the moment is there isn't any transfer of control or power away from Abramovich. It continues at this moment in time. The club structure is unchanged. You still have Marina Granovskaya as a director. You still have Eugene Tenenbaum. These are big allies of Abramovich. And therefore, I think the trustees are a little bit concerned that there might be the impression that Chelsea is being handed over to a charity, and therefore, in the worst case scenario for Abramovich, should he be sanctioned by the British government, then the British government may look at Chelsea as a football club and say, well, they're run by a charity. How can we do anything? And they're run by people like Emma Hayes and Piara Power and Hugh Robertson. So how can you put sanctions against them? So I think that's one concern, that trustees would not want to be used in that way and put into a really invidious position. The flip side of that is there may be a sense also of just protecting the club. I mean, Chelsea's official position on this is we need to protect the club in terms of to deflect from any headlines that might be surrounding Roman Abramovich at this time. That's the club's briefing on this, that it's not about sanctions, it's about distracting from unwanted attention in the interests of the club. I think a lot of people who have been following this closely, who have heard in Parliament British MPs call for sanctions against Russian billionaires such as Roman Abramovich, are looking at it and saying the club might be preparing in some way for what would happen in the event of sanctions against a very successful Russian businessman at this time where there is, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And one of, the worst case scenario of sanctions is that Chelsea as an asset of Abramovich could be frozen. And that means you might not be able to pay your players, you might not be able to fulfill fixtures, you might not be able to use bank accounts. And clearly, that would become an existential threat for Chelsea. So there are some people who say that's what the motivation is. Chelsea, as I say, have always denied that there is a close relationship between Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and Roman Abramovich. They say he just happens to be a very successful Russian businessman. And that's where we are on Monday morning. Nothing has been signed over. Nothing has been agreed by the trustees. Talks continue. And and it's very complicated. Hopefully that explains it to a certain extent.
It does, and actually, as Adam has said there, Liam, that those within Chelsea, when Adam talks about that existential threat, that not being able to trade, not being able to use bank accounts, not being able to fulfill fixtures, those within Chelsea would be negligent if they weren't preparing for the worst case scenario. That's what all businesses have to do.
Yeah, it's crisis planning, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's why I think, when the dust settled on that initial statement on Saturday night, my first thought was, what can Abramovich see coming? This is not the first time there have been negative headlines about Abramovich, some of which he's challenged successfully in court. Others, have just been allowed to sort of slide. But this is the first time he's felt compelled to distance himself, at the very least on an appearance level, in this way. And that suggests to me, coming at the end of a week in which he was named in Parliament with MPs calling for him to be stripped of Chelsea and have assets frozen and all sorts of sanctions be taken against him, that suggests to me that at least Abramovich thinks, and there's always an element of speculation to this because Abramovich doesn't say very much, but that suggests to me that he at least thinks that there's more coming down the pipeline here that he has to worry about, and potentially Chelsea have to worry about as well. But as Adam has explained in detail, and of course our explainer, I thought Matt Slater did excellent work on that as well. This doesn't seem especially well thought out. It seems like quite a panic move. It was communicated on Saturday very, very quickly, as sometimes happens at Chelsea, where one man makes a decision and everyone else reacts. And it doesn't seem like it's a solution that's necessarily going to solve the problems that could lie ahead.
No, it's also interesting. A second statement came on Sunday morning. The first statement.
I'm not sure that massively. Did that help? The second statement?
Well, that's yeah. I mean, the second statement came. The first statement from Abramovich was from the owner and made absolutely no reference to world events or anything that might have taken place. The second statement was a club statement, and that came on Sunday morning, and it spoke, the club statement on the conflict in Ukraine. It talked about a situation in Ukraine. I think a lot of people looked at that and said, this should probably be called the war in Ukraine. It should probably be called the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There was no mention of Russia whatsoever in the statement. The interesting thing is Abramovich had said on Saturday night that he was handing over stewardship and care of Chelsea to the trustees. As I said, nothing had been agreed by the trustees at this stage. They'd not signed up to anything. Additionally, they had nothing to do with this statement that came on Sunday morning. And, you would think that reputationally, if you're talking about the care and stewardship of Chelsea FC, I'm not sure that statement was particularly good for the stewardship and care of Chelsea FC. And that's what kind of the point I was coming back to. The day-to-day running of Chelsea is unchanged at the moment. You still have Marina Granovskaya, Eugene Tenenbaum, who, by the way, was born in Ukraine, in the former Soviet Union. And you also have Petr Cech and Carlo Cudicini, all those sort of people that have been around Chelsea for a long time are still running the club on a day-to-day basis. So I think even if the intention was to give this outward appearance of Roman Abramovich is a bit more distance from the club, therefore, maybe the club might be better protected. If you apply like a modicum of analysis to that, it kind of falls down straight away. I mean, he is still the owner of the club. He's still, his company, Fordstam Limited, is still the ultimate parent company. That's not transferred any shares. It's still the responsible party. So it's going to be a really interesting few days. More talks upcoming. The other interesting person, Seb Coe, president of World Athletics, who is not officially a trustee, but has been involved in the talks. On Sunday, he was at the Chelsea table at the executive suite at Wembley. Again, one of the big concerns is the conflict of interest for all these different trustees. If you're Emma Hayes, you are the women's team manager And what, you're going to be responsible for running the club in some way? Same for Paul Ramos as finance director, even Bruce Buck. It would be a promotion of sorts for him.
Is this, and Adam's mentioned some of the players involved in the trust, Liam, a final one here, and this is for everybody working at Chelsea. Thought Thomas Tuchel spoke very well on Friday, didn't he? He really handled it. He handled it very well on Friday. But this is a tricky, and I'm trying to use my words carefully here because, you know, it's a horrendous situation for everybody who is in Ukraine. First of all, to caveat this, right? But this is a very tricky and difficult situation for people who work at Chelsea for Chelsea at the moment.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I think everyone, and Tuchel alluded to that, didn't he? That it had been affecting the players, it had been affecting him. I think they've received some measure of consolation from the fact that, you know, from their perspective, nothing's really going to change. As Adam said, Marina Granovskaya is running the football side day to day, as she always was. Guy Lawrence is running the business side day to day, as he always was. But if you're kind of just like a rank and file staffer at Chelsea, it's got to be. I mean, they've been through plenty of awkward times before, but I think this seems to be a different level because there's an existential level of uncertainty around the club now. You know, there's never been this kind of threat to Abramovich's ownership. Nothing that has prompted him to take a step that, even if functionally it doesn't change that much in the short term, in terms of the significance, I think it's absolutely massive that he feels that this sort of thing is necessary.
The amazing line from Tuchel was, to a certain degree, I can understand the opinions and critical opinions towards the club, towards us who represent that club. I understand that, and we cannot fully free ourselves from it. I mean, for a Chelsea manager to say that is it's extraordinary.
Yeah,
and I think it's a huge credit to Tuchel that he was prepared, you know, to actually address that issue and not simply say, you know, I'm here to talk about football, because you couldn't separate it really on Friday.
It's more than you could reasonably expect of anyone who's functionally an employee of Roman Abramovich to say. And I don't think many previous Chelsea head coaches would have said that. But the general impression I got from Tuchel in that press conference was that he was speaking primarily as a concerned citizen of Europe.
It's also he does not he maybe ultimately reports to Abramovich, but he represents Chelsea Football Club. It's not his job is not to represent Roman Abramovich, and you know, I think that's something that people like Emma Hayes, Bruce Buck will be thinking over the next few days. I represent the values of this club based in Britain, and you can argue over whether that is impacted anyway by who the owner is in some ways, but I think we have to remember that you're working for an institution, not necessarily for the individual who happens to own that institution at a certain time. So there's a slight distinction, but it's definitely very interesting over the next few days.
Yeah, and I think he's done a very good job of providing a human, empathetic face to that institution in a way that Abramovich often doesn't, purely just because he's so silent all of the time.